This is Anna from the Pop Prism Power Podcast, and this is the Geek World All-Stars Podcast Network.
Welcome to the continued podcast adventures of Superhero Speak.
But I think many of the people that love this character and that love superheroes in general have used these stories as inspiration to say, you know what, I'm going to do something good in the world. I'm going to make a difference like my hero when I was a kid.
That is my fondest memory of it, because when you're doing comic books, you want them to affect people.
Right.
You want people to care. You want to strike emotions. And I knew that Clone Saga was striking a lot of emotions.
Can you imagine Pulp Fiction starring Goofy and Mickey Mouse?
I can totally imagine that.
I'm sure somebody's written that one too.
Quarter pounder with cheese in France, Mickey? What? Royale with cheese. Yeah. I can totally.
See?
I would watch the hell out of that movie.
Yes, I gladly sacrifice that my progeny to you, almighty Marvel beast.
But Neil Adams is somewhere going, it's my time.
How do you measure success? Hey everyone, you're listening to Superhero Speak, and I'm your host Dave.
And JD.
And this week, boys and girls, John is off. He is on assignment, learning everything he can about possibly switching us over to a new recording software. But until then, we have a very special guest with us this week. JD, you remember we did the Nerd Madness competition?
I remember I came up with the idea. Yes, I actually stole it from someone else. So. Yes, I do remember that. I remember stacking the deck as much as I possibly could to get the comic that I wanted to win. So
well, I mean, yeah. So not only did the comic that win beat out all the other comics, which included Tom King's run on Batman, you had some of Snyder stuff in there too, right?
I did.
Yeah, and then it beat out, of course, Daredevil, the TV show, and then what blew all of our minds was Into the Spider-Verse. This is the juggernaut of all independent comics. It has to be, right?
The little engine that could.
Yes. And of course we're talking about the comic book story of professional wrestling, and of course our guest is the one and only Aubrey Sitterson, who is the writer of that book. How are you, sir?
Hey man, I'm good. And I'm thrilled to be here to show that ballot stuffing works.
Ah, cool.
Ballot stuffing, like, there's, I don't want to get too political right now, but, there's a lot of talk of different election strategies, and here's one that always works. Stuffing those ballot boxes. Voting early, voting often. And I'm thrilled to be a proof positive of that.
When you were a little kid growing up and dreamed of writing comics, did you dream that one day you would win Nerd Madness and be a guest on this show?
Yeah. Let's go with yes. Yes, I did. Hey, we're gonna start off hot, man. I'm gonna take issue with something y'all just said. That the comic book story of professional wrestling was an indie book. This thing was published by Penguin Random House, sir.
Well, this is true. Yes.
Little known publisher, Penguin Random House. This is no indie book, sir. This is a big major trade publishing release we're talking about.
Yes, no, you're right. You're right. But usually when people think of non-indie books, they only think of the big two in comics, which is Marvel and DC.
I'm giving you a hard time because this is something. So I've been doing retailer calls, cold calls for my new Dark Horse book, No One Left to Fight. And when I do that, some of the people I talked to last year about my wrestling book, and they say the same thing. They're like, "Oh yeah, we don't really do much with indie books here, and like we don't really like not a lot, but some shops do say that." And I always have to bite my tongue with them because I don't want to. I'm doing cold calls. I don't want to get in an argument with somebody. But it grates, it irritates because it's you're right. It is like a weird thing about comics. It's Marvel, DC, and then everything else is indie. But when you talk about the broader book publishing world, that's not. It's an odd distinction, to be sure. So since I couldn't argue with retailers, I'm arguing with you guys instead.
Oh well, that's perfect because actually that is an excellent question to start with. How did the book come about, and then how did it get published through? You said Penguin, right?
Well, yeah, the actual publisher was 10 Speed Press.
Okay.
And they're an imprint of the larger Penguin Random House publishing group. They actually came to me, man. My editor there, Patrick Barb, he was a Straight Shoot fan. And so he listened to me yammer about wrestling each and every week on Straight Shoot. And they had been doing a series of these books, the comic book story of blank, right? I think the first one was beer. They did video games, baseball. There's some more coming up, and I'm not sure if they're announced, so I don't want to spill the beans here.
Right.
But it's their line. And Patrick's a big wrestling fan, and he convinced them that, listen, we need to do a wrestling one. It's huge right now. We absolutely have to. And he had the bright idea for, when putting together the wrestling comic book, to reach out to the guy who's a comic book writer who has a wrestling podcast. So he reached out to me, asked if I was interested. I said, of course I am. And then I brought in my co-creator, Chris Moreno, who I had worked with previously on the graphic novel Worth that we did with the Roddenberry guys back in 2013, I think. And Chris... Chris is why this book was able to happen, right? Not just because it's a comic book and it needs art, but he's the perfect guy for it, man. Y'all have read the book, so I know y'all know how good he is. But if you're listening to this and you're not familiar, the comic book story of professional wrestling, it goes from the carnival days all the way up to the present. Individual chapters on Mexico, the UK, and Japan wrestling traditions there. And there are, Chris had to draw hundreds of wrestlers, of individual wrestlers, and that's hundreds of likenesses, which is really tough. And Chris is not only really, really good at caricature, he's amazing at period stuff and also cartooning, which was really important because for the first one we were depicting all these different eras, and for the second, the cartooning, what I mean by that is really using expressive art to convey ideas. That was crucial for this because it's 170 pages long, which is huge, but it's very small when you consider the breadth of what we were trying to cover. And so, there's a lot of text. There's more text in this than I typically like writing in my comics because I like my comics to I like to let the art shine because that's what I like about comics. Mm-hmm. But so there's a lot of text in it, but still there's so much heavy lifting that had to be done by the art, and that was all because of Chris.
Yeah, this book really worked. I remember when you announced this, I was a former Straight Shoot fan of one of my favorite wrestling podcasts. I didn't think it was going to work. I was like, how is he going to do this and keep it interesting?
You're a big Straight Shoot fan, but with so little faith.
But it was. I was worried that it would be like a textbook. I'm like, how is he going to pull this off? Because we've read Death of the Territories and stuff like that, really good books. Mm-hmm. But I didn't know how you were going to condense it all, and it is so entertaining.
Thanks, man.
The way. And like I said, I wasn't on board with it. Not I wasn't on board, but I was like, I'll check it out because I like Aubrey and I dig his work. Man, it worked so good. It really was my favorite book last year.
Thanks, man.
And I was the target audience, the prime demo for it, so it really worked. And I'm glad that it's kind of giving your career some real life and really gotten you going now with Dark Horse. And it's
Thanks,
exciting.
Man.
It's a damn good book, man.
Thank you, brother. It's funny. It's not the type of book that I would have ever – so the wrestling book, it's not the type of book that I would ever go out of my way to pitch because I like writing fiction. I don't – it's – and I wasn't opposed to it, obviously, because I did it. But, it wasn't a thing where I was casting around to do a history of wrestling graphic novel. But Patrick reached out to me, and honestly, it was the type of thing where, if it was going to exist, I want it to be done well. And I want it to be the right type of thing. And I knew I would be angry if anybody else did it, right? Both because they were doing it instead of me, and also because I figured they would take a different approach than I did. And so, yeah, it's a thing I'm really proud of. But man, it was a ton of work. It was so much work. I was writing G.I. Joe at the time, and I had kind of scheduled out. And I was doing Straight Shoot and my podcast Scald and stuff at the same time too. And so I kind of scheduled out how long I thought it was going to take to write this thing based on how long it took me to write scripts of G.I. Joe. And I figured out 3 pages into it, oh no, it is way more work to write a nonfiction history thing than it is army men shooting lasers at monsters, right? Not that I'm not proud of my G.I. Joe work, but this was definitely more difficult. It was a ton of work. And it's funny, I don't Man, JD, I'm like you. I typically don't like books like this, which is to say, like, kind of the non-history textbooky type comic books. I think,
Right.
that, you know, like, and the reason why, and so like so Patrick reached out to me and said, "Would you like to do this?" I said, "Of course I would." And we started the ball rolling, and then I had to like sit down and do some really serious thinking about how do I do this in a way that it's something that I would want to read, because I think that a lot of nonfiction comics, there's a couple traps they fall into. One is they're just anecdote instead of telling a story. And the difference, to my mind, is that anecdote is a thing that happened, right? It's not a narrative, though. And I think a lot of nonfiction comics just end up being lists of anecdotes. But if you're telling a story, if you're creating even a nonfiction story, if you're creating a story, there's a serious act of curation that has to occur, both in terms of what you choose to include, what you choose to leave out, how you choose to present it, how you talk about it. Like, all of these they need to be conscious decisions so that you're actually building a story. And, you know, you don't want to be flippant with the truth, of course, but you do want to be aware of how you're structuring this thing so that it actually has narrative beats, because otherwise it's just you're reading an encyclopedia entry. And then that's the other kind of pitfall that I think a lot of nonfiction work has to avoid and struggles to avoid, comics especially, is that, you know, at the end of the day, if you're writing a comic, there needs to be a reason why it's a comic. Right. And I think that sometimes when I read nonfiction comics work, I find myself thinking, you know, I would much rather this be prose. Right. Like, it would be they could get more information in faster and more efficiently. And the art's boring. And there's like no reason, like, you know, there's a picture here, but like it doesn't really add anything. Like, I'm really just looking at the text. And so those were the things I really wanted to avoid. And so, you know, it's called The Comic Book Story of Professional Wrestling. And so it was really important to me and Chris that it be a narrative, that it be a story. And then the other thing, and this is one of the things that took the most time, you know, like outside of the actual research, finding ways to communicate this stuff visually in the scripts so that Chris had interesting things to draw and that it was justified in being a comic. And that was tough, man. And I realized early on that there were like certain things that I was leaning on and I had to get away from. Like, I don't know, like originally, like every 2 or 3 pages, I had people shaking hands, just making deals. And it's like there's only so many handshakes we can have in this one comic, right? But yeah, like I'm with you. I typically don't like this stuff. So the fact that I won you over it means a lot. Thank you.
Like I said, like it could have gone one or two ways. It could have been really boring, or it could have been one of those weird Blue Water type of autobiographical books that are just weird. And
I've never actually read one of those.
I just looked at them. Like, someone said, "Hey, you got to look at one of these one time," and I don't even want to get into it. They're just so freaking bizarre. And this wasn't that. Like, this is something I'm passionate about, so I was excited to read it. And it worked really, really well. Like, way much better than I thought. So kudos to you on that.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate that.
What in your research, because you're a fan, what surprised you when you were doing this research for this book? Like, what stories kind of stuck out to you and go, wow, I didn't realize that as, you know, beforehand? You
know, so I was really fortunate. I wouldn't have been able to do this book otherwise, especially on the timeline that we had to do it on. I was fortunate in that I knew enough to do an outline. Right? Like, I sat down and without any research, I did an outline and got that approved, you know, and broke down the chapters. I was like, here's what roughly we're going to cover in each chapter. And I even did page breakdowns, right? Because it's just part of my process, especially, which I think it should be, especially if you're writing a graphic novel altogether, right? So I broke down what was going to be on every single one of the 170 pages before I started writing any of it. And I was able to do that without really doing much research. Like, I knew enough to know what I didn't know, right? So, like, that sounds like word salad, but you know what I'm talking about. Like, mm-hmm. I knew where like the gaps in my knowledge were, so I could go seek that stuff out. And you know, most of the research I did, it wasn't like from scratch research, you know, because like I had all the books I needed and I'd read them all before, some of them multiple times, and so I knew all that stuff. Most of the research was really just looking at updates. Except for the international wrestling chapters. which I just, I'm American and I am primarily American wrestling fan, and I've gotten more into Japanese stuff over the years, but still, like American wrestling is kind of my home base. And so I had to do a lot more research for those three, but the one that I probably had to do the most digging on, because I came in knowing the least about it, was the UK wrestling tradition. And I found that fascinating because it is so very different than, like Mexico and Japan have a lot of unique things about their wrestling tradition, but like if you think about like the evolutionary tree of wrestling, they branched off from American wrestling, right? Whereas British wrestling is kind of closer to the trunk of the tree. This is becoming a very convoluted metaphor, right? but American catch wrestling really came from British catch as catch can wrestling, and that was where like kind of the breakoff point was. And the UK wrestling tradition evolved very differently. It had different rules, and a lot of that stuff has been largely forgotten for reasons that we get into in the book, and I'm not going to bore you with them here, but the UK wrestling scene died out, and now it's come back. And it's come back as something very different than what it was in the old world of sport days. And as a result, that stuff, it's not lost to history. It's out there, but it's just things that it's a dead tradition, right? It's a tradition that reached a dead end. And that was the most interesting stuff for me to research, honestly, like all the Big Daddy stuff. And like I knew who Big Daddy was, but I didn't know the history of all of like the competing like promotions and organizations and trusts and stuff like that. That right. I found most fascinating because it was very similar to what was going on in America with the NWA at the time, but it was just British.
Yeah, I definitely agree. That was the stuff that I learned most of, because I think we're both kind of kids in the 90s. You grew up, and that's when Lucha really kind of exploded in the U.S. Mm-hmm. when the Japanese stuff got big over here too. But the UK scene is something I still – it's a big gap in my knowledge. And again, I didn't even pay attention to it until like Fergal Devitt started making it big. Like that's the first time I remember really paying attention to guys in the UK. That's really
and that stuff's
to say that.
And that stuff's so – I mean, that's what I'm talking about. Like that's –
yeah.
That's more of an offshoot of American style wrestling than it is. Like, and I know like they like to claim ownership of like this world of sport tradition and all, but that stuff died out. It was done, like wrestling was dead in the UK for a really long time. And when it came back, it was, they used some aspects of that, but it's really now part of that same American tradition. Whereas you talk about like the old, set of rules and stuff like that, like, and like the smaller rounds and everything, and just the way the matches were structured, totally different. Totally different.
So I'm kind of curious. You're writing a giant graphic novel like this, and I understand it wanting to not be anecdotal and more of a narrative. Was there ever a desire to embellish any of the stories that you included?
No, man. I mean, I don't think you need to because I mean, and in fact, like this was so the opposite was kind of a concern. It's, as a wrestling fan, you hear all these tall tales, basically, right? Mm-hmm. These legendary stories of Andre the Giant drank 800 cases of beer, like whatever, right? You hear all this stuff, and central to professional wrestling, this is something we keep coming back to in the book, is that it's a con, right? It's the work. It's the grift. It's that, the entire medium hinges on the audience thinking they know more about what's going on than they actually do, right? And that's like, and people talk about the death of kayfabe, and that stuff's irrelevant because it's still true today that, wrestling works by letting the fans think they know what's going on and who's booking and who's pulling the strings and why they're making the decisions they're making. And wrestling not only allows but encourages that so that they can then upset or deliver on those expectations. And so that's central to wrestling, and it's a central difficulty of writing about wrestling because everybody's full of shit. Right? Like every wrestler autobiography, every wrestler biography, every book about wrestling, like there come points where the people writing it, if they're honest, if they're autobiographies, they're usually not honest, right? Because they've got their own angle in terms of like what they want to get across. And this sounds like I'm being really critical, but I'm not. I love this stuff about wrestling, right? If you read a wrestler's autobiography, like there's true stuff in there too, but like, I don't know, like a lot of it's nonsense. A lot of it's like heavily massaged for them to get themselves over, because that's the whole point of writing a book, right? As a wrestler, is to get yourself over. So that was kind of the difficult thing, especially as like the mists of history become thicker, right? Like when you start like looking further and further back, it's like it becomes hard to separate out the truth from the work, especially like one of my favorite wrestling books of all time is Lou Thesz's autobiography, because it's like the earliest example of what became really standard for wrestler autobiographies, which is it's not real now, but it used to be. It was real when I was doing, it was real 20 years ago. And people are still doing that. Like people like that was like, if you remember like the last Undertaker Triple H match at like WrestleMania match, like that was the angle there. It was like, oh yeah, it's the last of their era, and it used to be real. It's not real anymore, but it used to be, and these guys are the holdouts from that. But like when those guys were doing their thing in the 90s, people were saying that about stuff in the 80s, like like it's this constant thing. So that was the difficulty for me, was making sure that it wasn't a question. Sometimes people ask me like, oh, how did you make sure that you weren't propagating these angles and these worked things and stuff like that? And like, that wasn't a concern of mine. The concern of mine was making sure that if I was doing it, I was acknowledging it. Right. Okay. And like, so I think the clearest example of doing that is how we talked about the Montreal Screwjob, right? Aubrey Sitterson personally thinks that shit was a work, right? Like I think that was planned, right? But like in the book, we talk about it like, we just talk about what actually happened, what we saw happen, what we know happened, what we've seen in video and stuff like that. Right. And then acknowledge that some people say it was a work, right? And that was kind of the thing for me. It's like recognizing that, and again, this is kind of one of the strengths of wrestling, is that it doesn't really matter if things are real or fake, right? Like that was one of the thesis statements of the book, right? And we wanted to get that right out in the front. It's like, we didn't want this to be one of those things where we're like explaining to people like, oh yeah, like, people think wrestling's fake, but blah, blah, blah. No. Wrestling is fixed, man. It's a fucking work, and it's been a work for the entirety of its existence. But that's like the least interesting thing about it. And like, so we try to acknowledge that up front so that we could then talk about the stuff that is interesting. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm talking in circles.
No, yeah. 100%.
Oh yeah, definitely. No, and I agree too, because like you said, people know it is a grift. It's people know that it's fake, or they know that a certain amount of it is fake, and they still accept it. And it's like you said, trying to figure out what's real and what isn't real, and that's the enjoyment behind it.
It's the magic trick.
It's a magic trick.
Like the magician really didn't pull a rabbit out of a hat, but you're curious how he did it, and you get lost in the moment.
And that's exactly right. Like it's if you've seen The Prestige, that like in order for a magic trick to work, the audience has to want to be fooled on some level, right? And the same thing is true of wrestling. And the smarter the mark, the more it's true, right? And like they're getting worked by different things, but there's plenty of people who fancy themselves really, really smart wrestling fans. They think that they're above all this stuff, but they're still getting pulled in just by different things, right? They're getting pulled in by the dirt sheet rumors, or who they think is going to leave and go to AEW, or who's getting called up from NXT, or, like who has heat with The Office, right? Like that's all part of it. And it's become like wrestling's constantly changing in that respect, which is fascinating too, I think.
See, and that's why I think this is why Straight Shoot was one of my favorite podcasts for wrestling. Like, I enjoyed listening to the Wade Keller, Dave Meltzer, the more journalistic-based stuff, but you frequently talked about wrestling being a con and said it in those words. And nobody else does that. I mean, we're all aware of it. I don't know if people, like, get uncomfortable with saying that word, but once you embrace that concept, you get so much more enjoyment out of it. and understanding they're constantly working you. Constantly.
I agree, man. I mean, like, obviously I agree because you're telling me something that I've said.
Yes.
Great point, JD. No, man, it's funny. Like, I think that there is this I understand the sentiment of wrestling is an art form. Wrestling is art. You know, like I get that sentiment. And I like, cause it's really about getting respect for wrestling and getting people not to look down their noses at it and like not to think of the people who watch it as like these ignorant mouth breathers. Right. I get, and I appreciate the thought behind that, but I really think that talking about wrestling, wrestling is an art, I guess, but more than that, it's a con, right? Like wrestling is an art form in terms of the fact that the people doing it are practicing an art. They are artists, and they put a lot of time. It's not a science, right? They put a lot of time and thought, and they have to be intuitive and react to the audience and play off them. Like, it is an art, but I don't think that this is the better way of saying it. Wrestling is an art, but that is not the best metric to use to discuss it, I don't believe, right? I think that wrestling is better understood and analyzed and even appreciated as a grift or a con, or like in the book we use like the metaphor of like a carnival game, right? It's like you know it's rigged. You know the carnival game is rigged because otherwise why would they have it there? It's a fucking carnival. But you do it anyways because you think that you might be the one to beat it, right? That you think you have like the insight to throw the ball in the basket and not have it bounce out, right? And I think that is a much more useful way to look at and discuss and understand and appreciate wrestling than as just a strict art form. And I think that when people get really upset about wrestling, which you're supposed to, right? That's the whole idea, right? But when they get so upset about it that like they're upset after they've left the arena and they go home and they're still mad about it. Once it gets to that level, I think a lot of it comes from expecting it to work the same way other types of media work that do not follow the same rules that wrestling does. And it's because wrestling is a con, man.
Personally, I come from a different world. Like, I'm an amateur wrestler. Like, I'm a high school wrestling coach, been involved in amateur wrestling my whole life. I found that because I loved pro wrestling. So, like, I've heard the whole, it's fake, it's not real. And that never bothered me. But I never quite figured out why it didn't bug me. But when you grow up watching movies, reading comics, wrestling's perfect into that. Like, it fits into that perfectly. You get the storytelling, and it manipulates you on an emotional level differently than any other form of media. And again, it was your words that really kind of shaped the way I thought of it. I'm like, oh yeah, it is. It's totally a con, and everything about it is manipulating you. Like, the manipulation doesn't stop when the bell rings.
Right. Yeah. Like, I mean, it never stops. You know, if you're talking to, that's the thing I tell people all the time. Like, if a wrestler or a wrestling promotion allows you to see something, right? Whether it's a tweet or an Instagram post or something on TV or something in their book, it's a work, man. Like the good ones, right? Like, cause that's their job. Anything that they're allowing you to see is part of the con. It's part of the grift. And it doesn't mean that they're lying all the time. It doesn't mean it's like opposite day where they don't believe any of the things they say. It just means that all of it is part of this performance. And it's a conscious decision to put forth whatever image, you know? And I think that is a big part of the resurgence in wrestling's appeal right now, because if I don't know most people, but like many people who live their lives primarily online, you know, we're more ready to appreciate and respect and engage with this idea that so much of what we do is performance, right? Even if it's true, it's performance because we're choosing what to put out there and how we want to be portrayed and how we want people to see us. And that is so integral to wrestling that I don't know. It doesn't surprise me that wrestling's gotten a lot popular as social media has gotten bigger. It doesn't surprise me that WWE specifically and wrestling generally have such a huge presence on social media, because wrestling has been doing what everyone does on social media now. Wrestling's been doing it since always.
Today they call it building a brand. like
Yeah,
people on
exactly.
Instagram. They're shaping what you want them, how you
It's their
want them to
gimmick.
think of them. Yes,
Exactly. It's their gimmick.
It's their gimmick, and it's the same thing. It's just the message is massaged a little bit better, which in itself is just another work.
Yep.
Everything
Exactly.
is wrestling.
Everything is wrestling.
So getting back a little bit to the comic book and the process.
No. We're going to continue going off on a tangent. That's all. Go ahead.
So you said it took a lot longer to write the book than you initially anticipated, and I can't even imagine how long it took to do the art for it. Is this, since this was something, became a much bigger undertaking than you initially thought, is it something you would ever tackle again on this scale?
You mean, well, like, I don't think I need to write the book again. You mean like any kind of nonfiction?
Right, like
stuff?
if someone said, "Oh, you did such a great job on the wrestling book. Could you do one on 3rd century paintings?"
No, thank you. You'll have to look elsewhere, friend. The problem is that there's not a whole lot that wrestling's the only thing that I think I know extensively enough to do something like this,
okay.
Right? Like, given enough time, anybody could write a nonfiction book about anything, right? Because you just need the time to research. Like, if somebody gave me a big enough sack of money for me to afford to just hole up in a cabin somewhere and read about, like, whatever school of painting, I could, but nobody's paying that to me to do that. Truthfully, my love is writing fiction. I'm glad I did this. I'm inordinately proud of it. I'm thrilled that the reception's been as good as it has. But there's not a whole lot, like, there's my other loves and, like, the things that I'm really, really into, like, even, like, comics history, like, which I think, Fred Van Lente, I think Ryan Dunleavy was his co-creator on, like, the comic book history of comic books, or I forget exactly what it's called. It's good though, even though I can't remember the name. I don't have the knowledge base to do that. As much as I love comics, I don't really know the industry of comics as well as I do just comics and how they work and what I like about them,
Right.
I love heavy metal, but I have very, very specific niche heavy metal interests, right? And, like, there's whole areas of heavy metal, like, for instance, like, new wave of British heavy metal. It is massively important. It is huge. It's some of people's favorite stuff. I don't really like it. It's just not my favorite. I don't really know a whole lot about it. There isn't really anything else that I could do a full history like this of. I have, like, there are things I'd like to do that are nonfiction, but they're much more narrative based as opposed to history based, if that makes sense.
No, definitely. Yeah. I mean, it definitely sounds like if you had an itch to do something like this, it's definitely been scratched.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, like, I do. It's funny. Like, I tweeted this a couple weeks ago, like, when AEW announced that their like TNT TV deal. Like, every time something like that happens, like some big wrestling news, my first thought is, oh man, that would have gone in the book. Like that, because, like, and that was one of the tough things too, is that we wanted to be as up to date as possible, right? Because we wanted it to be a perennial, right? We wanted this thing to sell, but being a perennial, like, in order to make it a perennial, like, we had to, like, balance two competing desires, right? One is that we want it to be current, so we want to have as much stuff up to the present as we could, but we also didn't want it to feel dated because of the stuff we included, because it's tough without the benefit of hindsight to really have an idea of what's important, if you're talking about a historical context. And to wit, like, I wrote the thing and Chris drew it, but with Daniel Bryan retired. Daniel Bryan had, gotten, I don't know what the right terminology for is, but, like, they put the kibosh on Daniel Bryan. WWE did. They said he couldn't wrestle anymore. That was too dangerous, and his brain had been rattled too much. Right. And then while we were doing lettering on the book, Daniel Bryan got cleared, and so we had to go back in and change some of the lettering to reflect that. And it's kind of it's a tough thing, man. It was really difficult figuring out how current we should get, not knowing how things were going to pan out. Like I think AEW hadn't been announced, but I think All In had been announced, and it's like that feels like a big deal, but it hasn't happened yet, and so we don't really know what to expect from it. And it could, something could go wrong, and it could not happen at all, and we don't want to include it in the book, not having happened. So, yeah, man, that was a real difficult thing, and so now every time something big happens, I start thinking about like the comic book story professional wrestling appendix, right? Like I would love to do, and like I know how I would do it too. Like I wouldn't do like a new chapter covering everything that happened since the book came out, because we would run into the same problem. We don't have enough distance on it to determine what's really important and to find the historical context. But I would love to do something where it's like, I don't know, like 2 or 3 additional chapters where I would cover some of the – I would do more like thematic based chapters so I could cover some of the things that either got short shrift or things I wish we could have gone into deeper but didn't really fit into our narrative, or it's stuff that has become more important in the past couple years, which there's a lot of as well.
Right.
So let's transition now. Talk about your new book. Talk about No One Left to Fight. How did it come about?
How did it come about?
Yeah.
Well, so my co-creator on that, Fico Ossio, we had been pals. We had met at San Diego Comic-Con back, last year's 18, 17. We met probably 2016 at San Diego Comic-Con. He's Argentinian. He comes up for San Diego every year. And we met on the floor and on like a panel, I think, too, because we were both involved with the Hasbro universe stuff at IDW. He was drawing the big Revolution crossover that brought all the properties together, and I was writing the G.I. Joe series that was going to be spinning out of it. We met then, we got along, and became pals and started keeping in touch. And then a year later at San Diego Comic-Con, we were hanging out, and we heard all of these screams on the floor of San Diego Comic-Con, right? From across the big exhibition hall, we heard, just like all these different voices doing that. And I was like, what on earth is that? And he says, oh, it's the Dragon Ball display. We did it. We waited in line for it. You get in this booth and you scream like you're powered up, and they do a video of you like bursting into like Super Saiyan like energy flames, right? And I was like, whoa, that's amazing. And we realized that we were both huge Dragon Ball fans, and we had been wanting to work together on something, and it just never really come together at IDW with the Hasbro stuff. We were always just on different things, and the schedules never lined up. And so we started talking in the wake of San Diego Comic-Con 2017, I guess, about doing something together and doing something Dragon Ball related. And it started really from a place of us just talking about all the stuff we love from Dragon Ball and things that we thought Dragon Ball did and did well, that part of this sort of subgenre of shonen fight manga and anime, right? Like there are other comics that fit in with that. It's different. Like Dragon Ball is it's a very specific thing, and we talked a lot about what we loved about it and what we would want to lift from it, right? And that was the starting place for No One Left to Fight. And from there, Fico had the idea of making it kind of like a road trip structure, right? And it's just something he really wanted to do because he wanted to draw these vehicles and draw different settings and environments. And it all kind of fell out of that, man. That was really the genesis of it, us listening to screams on the floor of San Diego Comic-Con.
So
yeah.
Tell me about the book. Like I just read it, but for people who don't know, tell me about No One Left to Fight. Like what is the pitch?
Yeah, it's everything we love about Dragon Ball. So it's the soap opera, it's the humor, it's the big explosive action. But instead of, a wall of 40 black and white right to left manga volumes, it's a 5-issue full color Dark Horse limited series. And, this is important because wrestling fans, which honestly there's a lot of overlap between wrestling fans and Dragon Ball fans. Dragon Ball fandom, it's bigger than just manga. right? There are people who are diehard Dragon Ball fans. They've never read any manga whatsoever, right? They watch the cartoons, they play the video games, they have the t-shirts, but they don't mess around with the manga. And this is, I think there's a lot of reasons behind that. But this is something that those folks can pick up, and it's meant to scratch the itches, scratch all those Dragon Ball itches, but put to a different purpose, right? We are taking those tropes and those characters, and we're using them to I tell people it's kind of like I describe it as like a rumination, right? Like it's a story about getting into your 30s, right? And dealing with all of the regret and the resentment and kind of like the angst that comes with getting a little bit older, having accomplished some of the goals you had, having failed at others, and realizing that you're kind of running out of time for meaningful course corrections, right? Like it's about it uses those Dragon Ball characters and tropes and that world to explore kind of, I don't know, a heavier theme that I think you typically get from an episode of Dragon Ball. Not to say that Dragon Ball doesn't get really deep into stuff, especially like father and son stuff. That's always an undercurrent in Dragon Ball. But we with No One Left to Fight, we're not doing a manga pastiche, right? Like it's not meant to be Aubrey and Fico do their version of manga. It's very much an American style comic, but it's just one that uses these tropes, which I think that to people who are diehard Dragon Ball fans or even casual Dragon Ball fans, they get it. But people who aren't might not fully understand. Dragon Ball's been around for 30 years, 3 decades, right? Which means that generations, multiple generations of people have grown up with this stuff. So characters like Goku and Vegeta and Bulma, they are as integrated into the zeitgeist and like seeped into people's brain pans as Superman and Spider-Man are. Like these are characters that people get and understand, and we're riffing on them in the same way that there are 1,000 superhero comics that riff on Superman and Batman as archetypes.
Right. I mean, I definitely love the art style in this book, and I kind of like how we're obviously not on Earth, right, in this book, but you never.
No, it's Earth.
Is it?
Yeah, it's Earth.
I didn't get that impression because of the.
It's not our Earth.
Oh, okay. See, there you go.
But it's like Dragon Ball. Dragon Ball takes place on Earth, but it's an Earth not like ours.
Right. But I'm saying, like, you don't spoon feed that kind of stuff to the audience. Like, you right away were introduced to someone who's obviously not a human being, and it's the main character's a friend of his, right? And it's like you just get right into the story. Where sometimes when you're introducing a world, sometimes there's a tendency to feed too much information in those kinds of things. And I really appreciate that about this.
Thanks, man. That's really great to hear, because I've got like a few storytelling maxims that I try and follow. And one of them is don't explain anything unless you have to. Right. And in fact, if you have to explain something, find a way to communicate that information that's not explanation. I hate stuff that starts with an info dump. I think it's lazy, and I think it indicates a certain disdain for the reader. Right. Because readers are smart. You're smart enough to figure this stuff out. Right. And like, here's the thing, like, you mentioned like, it's not on Earth. Well, it doesn't matter. Right? It doesn't matter what planet this is. It's not, it's totally irrelevant to the story. And so we don't mention it, And I think the same is true of character stuff. The book starts and our core cast, they're like in their 30s, but they've known each other their entire lives, and they've had decades worth of adventures together. One of the things that Fico and I both really loved about Dragon Ball is we started watching with Dragon Ball Z. Not together. We didn't know each other. But as kids, we both started watching with Dragon Ball Z.
Right.
And we both had the same wild experience, which is if you start watching Dragon Ball Z, which is a direct continuation of the original Dragon Ball,
right.
It starts and it doesn't hold your hand. It doesn't say, oh, hey, this is Goku, and here's his backstory, and here's who all these people are, and here's what Dragon Balls are, and here's what they do. And it tells you none of that. It just immediately gets into stuff, and he's meeting people who he's clearly known for decades, but they don't explain who they are or how they knew each other because it doesn't really matter, right? But
right.
It creates this depth. It makes it feel like a real lived-in world, and so that was really our goal, man. We wanted issue 1 to start and to feel like it was a world that's been running and churning for years, but you're just tuning in now.
That is totally the vibe. Like, there's enough familiarity with stuff. Like, it's got this suburban feel. Like, they're having dinner. There's a couch. Like, it's a familiar enough world where you can let the characters just kind of take over. And I love that about it. Like, I hate same thing. I hate when you start like some kind of a series and they just got to tell you 30 years worth of backstory before we even meet single character. Like, yeah. I'm not a Dragon. I've never watched Dragon Ball. I'm not much of an anime guy. So for me, this was a completely cold experience. But I clicked with it pretty quickly. Like, I got it right away. Like, I understand what's going on. I did not acknowledge the tropes because I just don't know them. But it still worked. Like,
that's really great to hear, man. Because like it is designed to play off these Dragon Ball tropes, and that's the starting point, but it really quickly spirals off in another direction, and we keep using the Dragon Ball tropes and bringing different pieces in and building off of them, but it is its own thing, like I think that like as it should be, right? Like that's how it was designed. But yeah, it's funny. David, the thing that you asked about, like, is it on Earth? And like, it's a really funny thing. And it cracks me up because a friend of mine read it. And one of his first questions was, well, I don't really know where it takes place. You never it's not clear where this takes place. Mm-hmm. I was like, who gives a shit? Why does it matter? And like, there is this, like, it's a strange thing in comics where, and I think it's an American comics thing too. This idea that, like, we got to know, man, we got to have the locator captions. We got to know, what continent it's on, what the country is, what time of day it is, what month it is. Like, give us all the information. Like, label
Chris Claremontism.
Yeah, dude. I don't know. The Chris Claremont defender has logged on.
I love Chris Claremont, but every single one. I do too. I love those books, but that's like the same thing. Like, every time, like, you open up an issue of X-Men, you know everything going on in 2 pages. Like, everything is clearly labeled.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's a thing. It's an approach that I'm not a huge fan of. I love Chris Claremont's work. I think that Chris Claremont has gotten a bad rap for that kind of stuff. If you read classic Chris Claremont Uncanny X-Men, it's not that. It's not like what people have, like, built it up to be in their heads. But that being said, yeah, man, I don't like captions in comics. I think they can be done well, but I think more often than not they're used as crutches and they're used to tell instead of show. I mean, this is what I was alluding to earlier, the comic book story professional wrestling. Like, initially, comic book story professional wrestling, my big idea was, look, we're going to do the entire history of professional wrestling, but we're not going to have a narrative voice, right? It's just going to be images, and it's going to be people talking, and we're going to get the whole history that way. And I realized, like, after trying to make that work for like 20 minutes, that, oh my God, that's impossible. That's just, it would need to be like 3,000 pages long. We just can't. But coming into No One Left to Fight, like, that is the approach, man. We don't want to hold your hand. We don't want to force you down a path. We want Fico's art to breathe, and we want it to feel like a real lived-in world. And one of my storytelling theories is, especially as it relates to comics, if you think about how comics work, it's panels and gutters. And I know sometimes there are gutterless pages, but just bear with me for a second, right? It's like the Scott McCloud thing, right? That the magic of comics happens in the gutters, right? The magic of comics isn't the beautiful images in each panel, although those are wonderful. The real magic is that in between those images, in the gutters, the reader fills in the blanks. Right? Like, that's the real power and the real appeal of comics, to my mind. Right? So the goal, of course, it is to produce beautiful looking pages and to tell compelling stories. But the way you do that, the way you really get stuff to stick into people's minds, is by allowing them to do the heavy lifting. and encouraging them to do the heavy lifting. So if you write a comic where you just lay everything out for everybody and just tell them everything, then they're not going to piece anything together themselves, and it's going to be like empty calories, right? They're going to burn through it in however many minutes it takes just to read the dialogue, which is how a lot of people read comics, right? They'll read it all and then they'll fling it on the pile and they'll move on to the next one. But if you can create something compelling with lacuna and like big like ellipses in the storytelling and stuff that's challenging while also being fulfilling, and that causes you to maybe have to go back and reread something or think about something a little bit more, or pick the book up a day or two later and think about the things that you might have missed in it. That to me is the real goal. I don't know. One of my favorite comic book creators of all time is Howard Chaykin, and I read Times Squared for the first time recently. Those two volumes. Have y'all read those?
Yes.
Oh, great. They're really great. They're really dense, and they're difficult. They are difficult reads in a way that like people in 2019 are not used to from comics, right? Like, and I'm not saying that comics have gotten dumber, or stupid, or anything like that, but people are used to something that kind of holds your hand a little bit more. And Times Square does not. It's difficult. I had to go back. I would go back a couple pages because I'm trying to figure out whether I missed something, or if it just hasn't been fully explained yet, or if it was just alluded to, or I misread. And it's not that it wasn't because it was poorly done. It's because that's how it was designed. It was designed to force me to engage with it, right? I remember reading an old interview with Howard about American Flag, which is one of my favorite comics of all time. And the interviewer was saying, I read the first issue of American Flag and I found it pretty difficult. And I couldn't really tell what was going on and this kind of thing. And Howard's response was, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, well, you should read it again, slower, right? Like, take your time with it. And like, that's the goal with No One Left to Fight. It's meant to be a rumination, and ruminate is a really great word, I think. Because I think like I originally read it in I meant to look this up before I came on the air because I knew I was going to be talking about this. I think I read it in like a translation of some Nietzsche essay where he talks about how this is going to be a rumination on whatever. And to ruminate is what cows do to their cud, right? They get a mouthful of grass or hay or whatever, and they just gnaw on it for a while. That's how then they digest it by actually chewing on it. It's an active digestion. At least that part of it is an active process for ruminants. That's like the name of that type of beast. And those are my favorite types of stories. Ruminations, stuff that you really have to chew on, right? Stuff that finds a theme, and instead of just, mapping out characters or beats one-to-one to a very simple idea, and there's your metaphor, take it or leave it. I like stuff that finds a theme and dances around it and really lets the reader figure out what it's about. And if I'm being reticent, if I'm being like a little bit like holding my cards close to my chest on because y'all ask me what is it about? What's the pitch? And I feel like I haven't really clearly told you. That's intentional because I don't want to tell you what it's really about, because I think that would take away your enjoyment of reading this thing, of reading it and finding out what it's about, honestly.
Well, and I wanted to hear what you had to say, to be quite honest with you, because it is an interesting read. Like, it doesn't read like a lot of other things on the market. It doesn't read like a typical big two superhero book.
Yeah, I mean, and that's really by design. And so I'm really thrilled to hear you say that. It's and it's not specific. And I know a lot of people will probably look at it and expect something that is paced like manga, and it's not. I mean, there are things that we pull from manga, but mostly just because we like it, right? There's just elements that it's really cool how I was reading. So I don't know. While I was writing a bunch of No One Left to Fight, I was powering through JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which also is a road trip for a big part of it, right? Especially the Stardust Crusaders arc is all road trip.
Yeah.
And so there's stuff like that I pull from it, but yeah, man, it's a lot of different influences, and the biggest thing is that we wanted to do something smart that plays with emotional and character beats in a way that the reader pieces it together. That it's not a thing where you read it and say, oh, this character is sad, and I know they're sad because I'm reading this narrative caption where they talk about why they're sad. I think that that's cheap and it works. It's cheap and effective, but it's also, it doesn't have the staying power of a story where someone reads it and understands why the character is sad and figures out themselves why they're sad.
Right. Actually, that's something we've kind of discussed on this show a few times, and I'm curious to get your take on this. We seem to be more and more in a society where people want to be handheld. They want things explained to them. And I think a great example is in The Last Jedi, right? And Snoke came in, and then he was killed before he, and we were ever explained like how he got into power or whatever, but it doesn't really matter. It's not important to the story. But yet there are so many people who are upset that it was never explained, And whereas if you go back to the original trilogy, they never explained who the Emperor was,
Right.
In fact, you didn't even see him until Return of the Jedi, and then he was killed in that movie. So
they don't even explain who, like, I'm not a big Star Wars guy, but like they don't even explain who Boba Fett is. He's just this guy who shows up and he's like everybody's favorite character. Like, that's, but I think to your point, like that's proof of how this can work super well. Boba Fett does nothing in those movies but look cool and die, and yet he's everybody's favorite character. I don't think it's despite that. I think it's because of it. I think it's because of the mystery and the fact that viewers got to build the Boba Fett history for themselves.
Right.
That makes it more valuable.
So why do you think now there seems to be a shift for people wanting to be handheld and explained everything?
I don't know, man. I don't know if it really is a shift. I think that, like that interview I was talking about with Howard Chaykin about American Flag, that was like in the 80s that people were saying that. And
True.
I know, from talking with Howard, he's a pal of mine, like that is, and he's open with this when he posts on social media and stuff too. Like, the work he does, it's frustrating to a lot of people because he doesn't hold their hand and he, expects a lot of the reader and the reader isn't always up for it. And, so I don't think that's a new thing, man. I think that maybe it's exacerbated a little bit. You know what? I don't even think it's exacerbated a little bit. I think that the people who want to have their hands held, tend to be the loudest voices, especially on social media. Yeah. So I think that there is a increased sense that like, oh my God, everybody is just a lunatic and wants to dictate how Game of Thrones should have ended. When like, I don't really I think that that's true on that's true on Twitter, it's true on Facebook, but if you were just to take like an actual representative sample of Game of Thrones viewers and say, hey, what did you think about how, I forget those guys' names, but the guys who do Game of Thrones, what do you think about how they handled the end of the show? I think most people's responses would be, oh, I don't know. That's good. Oh, I liked it. I like the dragon fight or like whatever. Like I don't think that most people want to have, I mean, I don't know. Maybe we're talking about different things.
No. Yeah, no. I think you're on the same path of where I was going. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know. Like I don't know if it's gotten more so. I mean, I think it's always, and this is I don't think it's a clear binary either. I don't think that there's either easily digestible pablum or brilliant true art. Like I don't think I don't even think it's like a spectrum, like 'cause I think that you can do stuff that goes down easy and satisfies, right? And that I think is the goal, right? You want to be complex without being confusing. You want to be dense but rewarding. You want, it's, I don't know, that's the balance of doing good storytelling. And, No One Left to Fight, I think that we are doing something different than what people are typically used to, but I don't think that it's, I don't think it's going to be incomprehensible to people. I think it's just it's going to be a very different feel. That's the hope, at least.
I think mission accomplished. Like I said,
thanks, bro.
different, and I like that about it. Like I didn't know what to expect when I've seen it on social media and I've seen you plugging it for a while, so I wasn't sure what to say, and I was really entertained by it, and not in a way that I expected. Like I expected a bunch of big gonzo battles, and I imagine that'll come down the line. But what really won me over was as a guy in his 30s, the relatable characters in that regard. Like I could tell exactly what you're talking about. Is you see some regret, you see some baggage on people, and it worked. That's what won me over into this. Again, I have no knowledge of these tropes, so this is all fresh territory for me.
That's the heart of the story. It's outside of that the Sword and Sorcery podcast Scald that I used to do. This is the most personal thing I've ever written, for sure, outside of like journal entries, right? This is like this is the most personal narrative thing I've done outside of Scald, for sure. And it's heavy stuff, man. And it's I won't lie, it's kind of nerve-wracking knowing that it's going to be out in almost like a little bit less than a month while we're recording this. I'm really nervous about people's reactions to it because it is a personal thing and it is something really different. I think it's really different from other stuff on the racks, but it's also really different from stuff I've written before. Like it couldn't be more different, both from the wrestling book, obviously, but the G.I. Joe stuff I did too. It's very, very different. It's paced like an entirely different type of thing. And that was by design too. Fico and I had a lot of conversations about the rhythms of this thing and how we wanted it to feel. And hopefully that comes through on the page.
I see it.
Cool. And you just said that it's going to be out in a month.
Yep. It comes out on Wednesday, July 3rd. It'll be available everywhere.
Oh, okay.
And when is this going live?
This will be posted tomorrow.
Oh, great. Then there's still time. There's still time to go to your local retailer and tell them that you want the comic you always wanted. No One Left to Fight. The order code is May 190237. That'll help your retailer order it a little bit better. You have until Monday, June 10th to let them know. That's when their final orders for this thing has to be in. I don't know, if you follow me online, you've seen there's been a lot of chatter about this thing, man. A lot of comic book pros who I love and respect. I posted a thing. I mentioned him earlier. I posted a thing from Chaikin today. He posted really glowing things about it on Facebook. But comic pros and retailers have already started getting behind this thing. I spent the last month and a half calling like 425 different retailers. And
wow.
Once they – and, you know, some of them are busy. Some of them are friendlier than others. But all of them, once they see the art, once they see Fico's colors, they're floored and they get it. They understand, like, wow, this is – oh, it's Dragon Ball. It's Dragon Ball, but it's full color. It's an American comic. It's about this other stuff. They understand it. And, you know, hopefully they're all going to order enough copies, but maybe not. That's why it's really important to pre-order to make sure that you can actually get your hands on one on July 3rd. So go to your local retailer. Tell them, No One Left to Fight. May 190237. Pre-order it. Set up a subscription list at your friendly local comic shop. That's my advice.
So actually, I kind of do have a follow-up question to that. Is there?
Yeah, man.
Is this going to be an ongoing series, or do you have a so many story arc planned? We have this is a 5-issue limited series. Okay.
Right now. So it's, you know, it's the Hellboy model. That's what I call it. I don't know if there's like an official name for it, but Hellboy's the one who did it, you know, best and biggest and longest. We are doing 5 issues. That's what we're approved for. We have, you know, I mentioned earlier that, you know, we want it to feel like a lived-in world where you're coming in and there's just been decades of story. We have all that stuff worked out because we're crazy people, and we spent months just emailing each other back and forth about these characters and how they know each other and their backstories. And not only do we have all the history stuff, but we also have a bunch of future stuff planned out and things that we would love to get to. So in order for that to happen, though, it needs to sell gangbusters. It needs to sell well enough for Dark Horse to bring us back for another one. So that's another good reason to pre-order so we can do more of these.
Oh yeah, definitely. And yeah, both JD and I have looked at the book. It's really good. I definitely think people should run out and get it. And,
thanks, man.
Oh yeah. I mean, I wish you all the luck with this because it's.
Thank you, brother.
It's great, you know. So is this your first, because I know you've worked on G.I. Joe and other licensed properties. Is this your first original with Dark Horse? Sorry.
It is. It's my first work with Dark Horse at all. Okay. And it's my first. So look at this qualifier, because the comic book story of professional wrestling is also creator owned. That's owned by Chris Moreno and I. Oh, okay. But this No One Left to Fight is my first creator owned fiction work.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so it's my first creator owned series as well, because the wrestling book was a graphic novel. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's something different. It's a big deal for me, and I'm really excited about it. Dark Horse is a huge part of not only why I fell in love with comics, but why I wanted to be a comic book writer. Honestly, growing up, Hellboy, The Goon, Sin City, Akira, Lone Wolf and Cub, all so many different. Did I say The Goon? Grendel, yes. So many different comic book series, and manga translations and stuff that I absolutely adored. And, the thing I always loved about Dark Horse was that they did what I view, we talked earlier, this is good bookend, right? We talked earlier about the idea of mainstream comics, right? And mm-hmm. In comics, people talk about the mainstream comics is the big two, which is just to say superheroes. And that's odd for a million reasons, right? And there's historical reasons for it. I've read the books too. I get it. But it's always struck me as really odd because to my mind, real mainstream stuff is genre material done smart, right? Game of Thrones is a great example of that, mm-hmm. right? You take a genre, maybe it's maligned, maybe it hasn't been done well in a while, on a grand scale. You dust it off, you add some new life into it, you do it thoughtfully, you engage with the tropes, you do different stuff with it, and you end up with something that people really appreciate and love, and it appeals to a huge number of people. That's what Hellboy did, that's what The Goon did, that's what the Japanese manga stuff that Dark Horse is translated does typically. Dark Horse does real mainstream comics, and that's what we see No One Left to Fight as. It sounds arrogant to say, oh, yes, we're in the tradition of the greatest comics of all time. And maybe it is. But that's definitely the intent, right? Is that the same way that Hellboy plays with all of these tropes of, horror stories and old folklore and war stories and stuff like that, and weird fiction, we play with Dragon Ball. The same way Black Hammer plays with superheroes, we're playing with Dragon Ball. And that's the idea. And so Dark Horse is a perfect home for No One Left to Fight. And it means a lot to Fico and I both, to have it's Fico's first, creator-owned work as well. So for us to have our first creator-owned series at Dark Horse is a big deal for us. And we're really excited.
Right. And we already know that our audience likes, the comic book, story of professional wrestling. So they're definitely going to love this.
There's proof. There's incontrovertible evidence that they love it.
Exactly. Cool. So we've been about an hour, so I'm going to give you the question we normally like to wrap up on.
Uh-oh.
And that is, how do you measure success?
Ooh, that's a good question in light of No One Left to Fight, right? Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think about the right answer here. I really, honestly, I was going to say something funny. It's just, being able to not work with assholes, right? That's the real measure of success is just not having to deal with assholes in your daily life. But I think that's kind of a shallow answer. The real answer, man, it's something I'm kind of, bumping up against now, and I'm finally getting there, and I'm really loving it, is the freedom to do what you care about, the freedom and the opportunity to do things that are important to you, right? And it's not to say that other work I've done previous to the comic book story of professional wrestling and No One Left to Fight aren't important to me. Of course they are. I take a lot of pride in all of my writing and all my work, but the opportunity to do a thing that is my idea, right? My idea and Fico, we are deeply co-creators on this, right? Mm-hmm. The freedom to do something that's exactly the comic we want to do, right? Not something done to specifications, not like even the wrestling book. I'm really proud of it, and Chris and I did a great job on it, but that book had to hit certain beats, right? If you're going to do a history of professional wrestling, there's certain things that you have to include, right? If you want to do it well, which I did, right? No One Left to Fight is whatever we want it to be. And that is an incredible, sometimes scary amount of freedom, right? To have that blank of a canvas to work on. But I think that for me has always been the goal, is to get to the point where somebody says, yeah, tell your story, right? Like not, oh, tell your story to fit in between these benchmarks, or, tell your story to get this character from point A to point B, which I've done for publishers before, right? And that's just fun. It's still better than any other job I've ever had. But it's not the same as tell us your story. And that to me is what success is the freedom and the opportunity to do that.
Cool. I think another great measure of success is winning the Nerd Madness competition.
Of course.
Course.
That's like, let me do this again. Let me do another thing.
And speaking of online competitions, where can people find you online?
I'm Aubrey Sitterson everywhere. It's super easy. It's just AUB. It's my name. AUBREYSITTERSON. That's me on Twitter. That's me on Instagram. It's me on .com, AubreySitterson.com. The one place it's different is Facebook. I'm Charles Aubrey Sitterson there because I used to have an author page, but then they changed the algorithm so nobody saw my posts there. So now I just post everything to my personal page. So come find me on my personal page. Sometimes my mom comments. You can talk to my mom on Facebook, which is nice. She'd love to meet you.
Awesome. Oh, everyone should do that. Go meet his mother.
Everybody go meet my mom. Yeah.
Cool. And on that note, I think we'll put a pin in it this week, boys and girls. So, as always, thanks for listening, and don't let your cape get caught in the door. Have a good week.